Yeah. So I already touched on human rights, and the reason why I did human rights first because you're gonna see that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is in fact extension of the rights of human rights, but it's just qualifying what indigenous people are in humanity because indigenous people are the first people, the autochthonous people of the world, you know what I'm saying? And for us, people who think they black, especially, we need to come to the understanding that there aren't anybody more indigenous on this planet than us. So for you to understand your roots is more than just a matter of you just knowing, you know, who you are. I mean, yeah, what's more important than knowing who you are? But to know what goes along with that is even more important because our people don't understand that they are the mothers and fathers of civilization. So a lot of these sciences and mathematical formulas and everything, economic, you name it, all of it comes from us. But it amazes me how, you know, a lot of things they keep us out of. I mean, it's crazy how the whole economic structure is predicated on our ancient technologies and sciences. But right now, today, they tell the descendants of the people who came up with these formulas and sciences that they not worthy to even hold a low-level job with some corporations. You know what I'm saying? But it's all due to, you know, mass manipulation and mass I want to say indoctrination, you know. But nonetheless, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, resolution adopted by the General Assembly without reference to a main committee. Number 61 out of 295. United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the General Assembly taking note of the recommendations of the Human Rights Council contained in its resolution 1 out of 2 of 29 June 2006, by which Council adopted the text of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, recalling its resolution 61 out of 178 of 20 December 2006, by which it decided to defer consideration and action on the declaration to allow time for further consultations thereon, and also decided to conclude its consideration before the end of the 61st session of the General Assembly. Adopts the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as contained in the annex to the present resolution. 107 plenary meeting, the 13th September of 2007. Annex. United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the General Assembly, guided by the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and good faith in the fulfillment of the obligations assumed by states in accordance with the Charter, affirming that indigenous people are equal to all other peoples, while recognizing the rights of all people to be different, to consider themselves different, and to be respected as such. Affirming also that all people contribute to the diversity and richness of civilizations and cultures, which constitute the common heritage of humankind. Affirming further that all doctrines, policies, and practices based on or advocating superiority of peoples or individuals on the basis of national origins or racial, religion, ethnic, or cultural differences are racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. Then you know it's a fraud. Reaffirming that indigenous people in the exercise of their rights should be free from discrimination of any kind. Concerned that indigenous people have suffered from historic injustices as a result of inter alia. Look it up, inter alia. Their colonization and disposition of their lands, territory, and resources, thus preventing them from exercising in particularly their right to develop in accordance with their own needs and interests, recognizing the urgent need to respect and promote the inherent rights of indigenous people, which derive from their political, economic, and social structure and from their cultures, spiritual traditions, histories, and philosophies, especially their rights to their lands, territories, and resources. Recognizing also the urgent need to respect and promote the rights of indigenous people affirmed in treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements with states. Welcoming the fact that indigenous people are organizing themselves for political, economic, social, and cultural enhancement, and in order to bring to an end all forms of discrimination and oppression wherever they occur, convinced that control by indigenous people over developments affecting them and their lands, territories, and resources will enable them to maintain and strengthen their institutions, culture, and traditions, and to promote their development in accordance with their aspirations and needs. Recognizing that respect for indigenous knowledge, culture, and traditional practices contributes to sustainable and equitable development and proper management of the environment, emphasizing the contribution of the familiarization of the lands and territories of indigenous people to peace, economic and social progress and development, understanding, and friendly relations among nations and people of the world. Recognizing in particular the rights of indigenous families and communities to retain shared responsibility for the upbringing, training, education, and well-being of their children, consistent with the rights of a child. Considering that the rights affirmed in treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements between states and indigenous people are, in some situations, matters of international concern, interest, responsibility, and character, considering also that treaties, agreements, and other constructive agreements and relationships they represent are the basis for a strengthened partnership between indigenous people and the states, acknowledging that the Charter of the United Nations and the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action affirmed the fundamental importance of the right to self-determination of all people, by virtue of which they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Bearing in mind that nothing in this declaration may be used to deny any people their rights to self-determination exercised in conformity with international law, convinced that the recognition of the rights of indigenous people in this declaration will enhance harmonious and cooperative relationships between the states and indigenous people based on principles of justice, democracy. That should not be democracy. It should be a public form of government. Respect for human rights, non-discrimination, and good faith. Encouraging states to comply with the effective implement all their obligations as they apply to indigenous people under international instruments, in particular those related to human rights, in consultation and cooperation with the peoples concerned. Emphasizing that the United Nations has an important and continuing role to play in promoting and protecting the rights of indigenous people. Believing that this declaration is further important step forward for the recognition, promotion, and protection of the rights and freedoms of indigenous peoples, and in the development of relevant activities of the United Nations system in this field. Recognizing and reaffirming that indigenous individuals are entitled without discrimination to all human rights recognized in the international law, and that indigenous people possess collective rights which are indispensable for their existence, well-being, and integral development as people. Recognizing that the situation of indigenous people varies from region to region and from country to country, and that the significance of national and regional particularities and various historical and cultural backgrounds should be taken into consideration. Solemnly proclaims the following United Nations declarations on the rights of indigenous people as a standard of achievement to be pursued in a spirit of partnership and mutual respect. Whew. Article 1. Indigenous people have the right to the full enjoyment as a collective or as individuals of all human rights and fundamental freedoms as recognized in the Charter of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and international human rights law. Article 2. Indigenous people and individuals are free and equal to all other people and individuals and have the right to be free from any kind of discrimination in the exercise of their rights, in particular that based on their indigenous origin or identity. They can't tell you who you are. Article 3. Indigenous people have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Article 4. Indigenous people, in exercising their right to self-determination, have the right to autonomy or self-government in matters relating to their internal and local affairs, as well as ways and means for financing their autonomous function. So when you've been an autonomous people, you set your laws up and you run your society the way you want. It ain't everybody have to follow one rule and all that stuff that they teach. Anyway, Article 5. Indigenous people have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinct political legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions while retaining their right to participate fully, if they so choose, in the political, economic, and social and cultural life of the state. So there you have it, Moors. You had a right to do both. Article 6. Every indigenous individual has a right to nationality. You seen that also in the human rights, huh? So they reiterated it again in the indigenous rights. You have a right to nationality. Indigenous individuals have rights to life, physical and mental integrity, liberty and security of person. The same thing you heard in the human rights. It's going it's gonna mirror human rights word for word, verbatim. When I think about it, it just as for a fact, as a indigenous person, human rights apply to you most so because you are the first people. You the first human. You know. So Article 7, indigenous individuals have right to life, physical and mental integrity, liberty and security of person. 2, indigenous people have the collective right to live in freedom, peace, and security as a distinct people and shall not be subject to any act of genocide or any other act of violence, including forcibly removing children of the group to another group. So CPS can't come get no indigenous child. Article 8. You good. Article 8. 1. Indigenous people and individuals have the right not to be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture. 2. States shall provide effective mechanisms for prevention of and redress for A. Any action which has the aim or effect of depriving them of their integrity as distinct peoples or of their cultural values or ethnic identities. B. Any action which has the aim or effect of dispossessing them of their lands, territories, or resources. C. Any form of forced population transfer which has the aim or effect of violating or undermining any of their rights. D. Any form of forced assimilations or integrations. E. Any form of propaganda designed to promote or incite racial or ethnic discrimination directed against them. Article 9. Indigenous people and individuals have the right to belong to an indigenous community or nation in accordance with the traditions and customs of the community or nation concerned. No discrimination of any kind may arise from the exercise of such a right. Article 10. Indigenous people shall not be forcibly removed from their lands or territories, nor relocations shall take place without the free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous people concerned, and after agreement or just and fair compensation, and where possible, with the option of return. Article 11. 1. Indigenous people had a right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs. This includes the rights to maintain, protect, and develop the past, present, and future manifestations of their cultures, such as archaeological and historical sites, artifacts, designs, ceremonies, technologies, and visual and performing arts and literature. Two, states shall provide redress through effective mechanisms, which may include restitution, developed in conjunction with indigenous peoples with respect to their cultural, intellectual, religious, and spiritual property, taken without their free, prior, informed consent or in violation of their laws, traditions, and customs. 12. 1. Article 12. 1. Excuse me. Indigenous people have the right to manifest, practice, develop, and teach their spiritual and religious traditions, customs, and ceremonies, the right to maintain, protect, and have access and privacy to their religious and cultural sites, the right to use and control their ceremonial objects, and the right to repatriation of their human remains. 2. States shall seek to enable the access and or repatriation of ceremonial objects and human remains in their possession through fair, transparent, and effective mechanisms developed in conjunction with indigenous people concerned. Article 13. Indigenous people have the right to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their histories, language, oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, and literature, and to designate and retain their own names for communities, places, and persons. 2. States shall take effective measures to ensure that this right is protected and also to ensure that indigenous people can understand and be understood in political, legal, and administrative proceedings where necessary through the provisions of interpretations or by other appropriate means. Article 14. 1. Indigenous people had a right to establish and control their educational systems and institutions providing education in their own languages in a manner appropriate to their cultural methods of teaching and learning. 2. Indigenous individuals, particularly children, had a right to all levels and forms of education of the state without discrimination. 3. States shall, in conjunction with indigenous peoples, take effective measures in order for indigenous individuals, particularly children, including those living outside their communities, to have access, when possible, to an education in their own culture and provided in their own language. Article 15. 1. Indigenous people had a right to the dignity and diversity of their cultures, traditions, histories, and aspirations, which shall be appropriately reflected in education and public information. 2. States shall take effective measures in consultation and cooperation with the indigenous peoples concerned to combat prejudice and eliminate discrimination and to promote tolerance, understanding, and good relations among indigenous peoples and all other segments of society. Article 16. 1. Indigenous people had a right to establish their own media in their own languages and to have access to all forms of non-indigenous media without discrimination. 2. States shall take effective measures to ensure that state-owned media duly reflect indigenous cultural diversity. States without prejudice to ensuring full freedom of expression should encourage privately owned media to adequately reflect indigenous cultural diversity. Article 17. 1. Indigenous individuals and peoples have the right to enjoy fully all rights established under applicable international and domestic labor laws. 2. States shall, in consultation and cooperation with indigenous people, take specific measures to protect indigenous children from economic exploitation and from performing any work that is likely to be hazardous or to interfere with the child's education or to be harmful to the child's health or physical, mental, spiritual, moral, or social development, taking into account their special vulnerability and the importance of education for their empowerment. 3. Indigenous individuals have the right not to be subjected to any discriminatory conditions of labor and inter alia, employment, or salary. Article 18. Indigenous people had a right to participate in decision making in matters which would affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures, as well as to maintain and develop their own indigenous decision making institutions. Article 19. States shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the indigenous people concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them. Article 20. 1. Indigenous people had a right to maintain and develop their political, economic, and social systems or institutions to be secure in the enjoyment of their own means of subsistence and development and to engage freely in all their traditional and other economic activities. 2. Indigenous people deprived of their means of um, subsistence, subsistence and development are entitled to just and fair redress. Article 21. 1. Indigenous people had a right without discrimination to the improvement of their economic and social conditions, including inter alia in the areas of education, employment, vocational training and retraining, housing, sanitation, health, and social security. 2. The state shall take effective measures and, where appropriate, special measures to ensure continuing improvements of their economic and social conditions. Particularly, attention shall be paid to the rights and special needs of indigenous elders, women, youth, children, and persons with disabilities. Article 22. 1. Particular attention shall be paid to the rights and special needs of indigenous elders, women, youth, children, and persons with disabilities in the implementation of this declaration. 2. States shall take measures in conjunction with indigenous people to ensure that indigenous women and children enjoy the full protection and guarantees against all forms of violence and discrimination. Article 23. Indigenous people have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies of exercising their right to development. In particular, indigenous people had a right to be actively involved in developing and determining health, housing, and other economic and social programs affecting them, and as far as possible, to administer such programs through their own institution. Article 24. Indigenous people had the rights to their traditional medicines and to maintain their health practices, including the conservation of their vital medicinal plants, animals, and minerals. Indigenous individuals also had a right to access without any discrimination to all social and health services. Two, indigenous individuals had the equal right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. States shall take the necessary steps with a view of achieving progressively the full realization of this right. Article 25. Indigenous people had a right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationship with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used lands, territories, waters, and coastal seas and other resources, and to uphold their responsibilities to the future generations in this regard. Article 26. 1. Indigenous people had the rights to the lands, territories, and resources which they had traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. Two, indigenous people had the rights to own, use, develop, and control the lands, territories, and resources that they possess by reason of traditional ownerships or other traditional occupation or use, as well as those which they have otherwise acquired. Three, states shall give legal recognition and protections to these lands, territories, and resources. Such recognition shall be conducted with due respect to the customs, traditions, and land tenure system of the indigenous people concerned. Article 27. States shall establish and implement, in conjunction with indigenous people concerned, a fair, independent, impartial, open, and transparent process giving due recognition to indigenous peoples' laws, traditions, customs, and land tenure systems to recognize and adjudicate the rights of indigenous people pertaining to their lands, territories, and resources, including those which were traditionally owned or otherwise occupied or used. Indigenous people shall have the right to participate in this process. Article 28. 1. Indigenous people have the right to redress by means that can include restitution or, when this is not possible, just, fair, and equitable compensation for the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned or otherwise occupied or used, and which have been confiscated, taken, occupied, used, or damaged without their free, prior, and informed consent. Two, unless otherwise freely agreed upon by the people concerned, compensation shall take the form of land, territories, and resources equal in quality, size, and legal status, or monetary compensation or other appropriate redress. Article 29. 1. Indigenous people had a right to the conservation and protection of the environment and the productive capacity of their lands or territories and resources. States shall establish and implement assistance programs for indigenous people for such conservation and protection without discrimination. Two, states shall take effective measures to ensure that no storage or disposal of hazardous materials shall take place in the lands or territories of indigenous people without their free, prior, and informed consent. Three, states shall also take effective measures to ensure, as needed, that programs for monitoring, maintaining, and restoring the health and of indigenous people as developed and implemented by the peoples affected by such materials are duly implemented. Article 30. 1. Military activities shall not take place on the lands or territories of indigenous people unless justified by relevant public interest. or otherwise freely agree with the requested by the indigenous people concerned. Two, states shall undertake effective consultation with the indigenous people concerned through appropriate procedures and in particular through their representatives institutions prior to using their lands or territories for military activities. 31. 1. Article 31. 1. Indigenous people had a right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions, as well as the manifestations of their sciences, technologies, and cultures, including human and genetic resources, seeds, medicines, knowledge of the properties of the fauna and flora, oral traditions, literatures, design, sports, and traditional games, and visual and performing arts. They also had a right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their intellectual property over such cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions. Two, in conjunction with indigenous people, states shall take effective measures to recognize and protect the exercise of these rights.